Good morning, dolls, and welcome to Little Gretchen's workshop. So I had this little box that I received a gift in. It was actually sort of like a protector box for a smaller item. And I saved it because I definitely felt like it was something I'd be able to use later. So I kept it in my "What are you keeping that for" drawer. And today I decided I think it would be a good size to create a small luggage. Now I've made several different types of luggage or traveling bags here on the channel. And I will leave links in the description so you can see the other varieties. Now at this point I have trimmed off the original hinge and sanded it, and now the two halves will line up nicely and I can add my own hinge. Now for this little box, I'm going to stretch the fabric over it before I add my hinges. So when it comes to covering your box, the choice of your prints or fabric is totally up to you. And it depends on what type of mood you're trying to create. Now, I love this floral because it has little birds on it. And I wanted these pieces to look kind of quaint and feminine because I have several dolls to dress and bring to the rooming house community. So this is going to be a part of their luggage collection. Now, I'm focusing the pattern on a part that doesn't really show a very defined part of the design because I want it to almost look homey or possibly homemade. And here I am adding tacky glue to one half of the piece of luggage, and you want to spread it all the way out to the ends. Now in this instance, I'm not worried about excess glue use because I actually do want the glue to saturate through to the other side of the fabric. Now in order not to be wasteful, it would be a best practice to cut down your piece of fabric to more or less fit the size of your box, but because I use all my scraps anyway for something else, I wasn't worried about that. So after I trimmed off the excess and I made sure that the glue saturated all of the sides and I folded it up to the edges, when it dried, it was kind of hardened, so I used some really sharp scissors to trim off the excess. And I want you to pay special attention here as I trim off the corners because they're hardened with the glue, and I'm cutting it right up to the edge where it's going to be flush and nice and neat because the glue is hard. It's not going to separate. It's not going to fray, and that gives you a nice neat corner on the edges of your luggage. Now you want your scissors to be good and sharp and possibly not the scissors that you use for your good fabric because these pieces of fabric are hardened with the dry glue. So be conscious not to dull your good scissors. Now you'll notice in this frame that I am using my Beacons 3-in-1. Now I just happened to grab that because it was sitting close by, but I'm using it to seal down the interior flaps of my fabric. Now dolls, take your time. Don't be in a hurry to do this. You want to make sure you spread your glue all the way across to the corners so all the fabric can catch on the inside of the box. Now dolls, at this point I'm remembering and comparing the last time I added fabric to my luggage boxes. And I feel like my process is a little bit more fluid and simpler because I'm mitering these corners and smoothing things down with my little glue spreader. So in my mind, I feel like I've perfected my process a little bit more from the last time I did this. And that's what I mean when I say practice makes perfect, because each time you do something, each iteration, you see something from a different light, from a different perspective, and you find ways to improve. So dolls, you always want to keep your mind and your heart open to learn so you can grow and always create something that you love and you're proud of. Now at this point, I'm just trimming off a little bit more of those corners to make sure they look really neat and not clunky. And after I ensured that those inside flaps were solid, I added an additional layer of Mod Podge to saturate all the way through the fabric. And for some reason, when you put the Mod Podge on top of the fabric, it almost gives it like a vinyl type feeling and seals it in, so it helps it to resist dirt and stains in handling. And I also feel like it provides an additional layer of adhesion. Now here you can see I'm just checking the two halves to see how they line up because by adding that layer of fabric, it makes things a little bit thicker, so it makes me know that when the Mod Podge is dry, I'm going to need to trim down those corners a little bit more. Now you can see in this frame, I'm gently molding and trying to contour those corners while the Mod Podge is still wet. Now in this next frame, I'm trimming some little strips of fabric to cover up the inside of the second half of the box. I cut the fabric kind of shallow originally, and I don't want any of the plastic exposed, so I'm adding a little additional strip to make sure all of that is covered. And it's not a problem. It's slightly damp from the Mod Podge, but after I've got it fitted in there, I'm going to add a little bit more Mod Podge on top to saturate it. And these steps can be absolutely avoided if you take the time to measure the outside of your box, the inside, and how much you'll need to fold over, and then work methodically from your measurements and calculations. But yeah, dolls, that's not what I do. And when both halves are completely covered, you want to set them aside and allow them both to dry. Now, when my fabric was nice and dry where it wasn't tacky to the touch anymore, I chose a scrap piece of wallpaper to use as a lining for my little suitcase. And dolls, I always want to encourage you to use whatever you have on hand. So it would have been perfectly fine if you used the fabric that you used on the outside, but I just happen to have this lovely scrap that I think will coordinate really well. So never throw away your wallpaper scraps, even if they're not big enough to put on a wall. The scraps are really great for lining your suitcases or your trunks or other tiny boxes. And I really like this particular print wallpaper, one, because it's an older print, and older paper was generally printed on heavier, more sturdy paper. And it also has a date stamp on it that says 1979. So yep, that would make me a little bit partial. And I was really tickled about how this was turning out. I was really excited because I was just playing around again, just having some fun. But after getting to this point with this one, I was inspired and so excited, I went on and made some more. Now, these wooden luggages were made with a technique that I actually shared in a video earlier in the channel, and I will leave a link in the description so you can see those videos. But I want to share really quick how I add my hinges. Now, I don't use rivets, screws, or nails or anything like that. I like Loctite super glue gel. Now, I'm sure other super glue gels will work just as well, but I have a preference for Loctite. Again, this is not sponsored. I just like Loctite. And I just lay my hinges right on top of it. Make sure you don't allow the glue to get inside the mechanism where the hinge opens and closes. You just want it on the flat part where the rivets or the nails would be. Now, dolls, this is something I do all the time, so you may need to take more time with it. Don't be afraid of it, but you do want to be precise in how you line it up because you don't have a lot of time. You may possibly have time for one adjustment, and that's it. It's going to set up and lock down. And it may be a good practice to mark where you're going to put it. Now, in this frame, you can see I'm using rubber bands to hold my two halves in place, but masking tape or painter's tape are both quite effective because the objective is to keep your two pieces parallel and help you to know where your margins are. Now, when you first take your rubber band off, you want to open it really gently to ease the hinges open. You don't want to snatch them off really quick to open it fast because you'll pull them off. And after the initial opening, it'll open really nice and neat. It'll open smoothly, but you got to make sure it's completely dry before you try to handle it too much. And keep in mind, although it locks down really quickly, you need to allow it to completely cure for a permanent secure bond. So I usually like to open it up a little bit and let it continue to cure while the box is open. So I want to share really quickly that the technique of gluing the hinges on works just as well on the fabric covered boxes. And you're going to use the exact same process using the tape or the rubber band to keep everything lined up. And then you're going to add the glue and then lay your hinges right on top. Now make sure you don't remove your rubber band or your tape until you feel that the bond between the hinge and the box is secure. Then gently open it and allow it to finish curing. After I was done with the fabric boxes, I went on to cover one of the wooden boxes with some faux leather made simply with brown paper bag, acrylic paint, and some Mod Podge. Now, I shared the process of making faux leather in a couple other videos, and I will leave links to those in the description. And this material is handy for making books, bags, and straps. But I'm using the exact same technique to cover the box. Now, it's a little bit easier to cut because it's just paper. And again, you want to make sure you're using some good sharp scissors, but not your good fabric scissors. When I was a little girl, I used to get in trouble for using my mom's good sharp fabric scissors for paper projects. Now, applying this is the exact same process. So you want to add glue, smooth it out, and stretch it just like you did the fabric. But if things get a little bit bunchy, it's not a big deal. Just gently lift the paper off and smooth it out. And if it tears, don't worry, it's just paper. So while that's drying, let me show you what else I did. Now from this angle you can see this has been covered with fabric and already lined. But in addition to that, I used some ribbon to use as the trim or the straps on it. And I just want to show you really quick that I added some tiny buckles to it as well. Now in this frame, I'm just adding a little bit of tacky glue to the end of the cut ribbon and treating it like it's fray check, because it makes the ribbon a little bit firmer, which makes it easier to thread the buckle through. Now I did add a little dab of glue on the underside of the buckle to keep it in place as well. And in addition to putting glue on there to keep the buckle in place, I put a little extra just to keep it positioned right at the edge of the suitcase. And here I'm adding the second buckle to the other ribbon, and adding glue to the tip of that ribbon really firmed it up and made it easier to thread. And this is absolutely an instance when the precision tweezers come in really handy. Now that the buckle is on and secure, I wanted to add a strap. Now I added a strap using a tiny piece of scrap leather that I cut into a strip. Now I positioned it on there a little bit long, so I'm just using my craft knife to trim off the excess. And always be mindful of your fingers anytime you use your craft knife. Now this is the part I consider the fun part. It's when I add my extra tiny details in the form of nail art. And I use nail art a lot in my miniatures because I feel like if it fits on the end of my nail, it's perfect for miniatures. And it adds a lot of really fine details. And using nail art with miniatures is very convenient because I rarely have to be concerned about scale. And again, this is one of those things you can add as much or as little as you like. But for me, the more tiny details, the better. And if you've never made a tiny luggage, grab a tiny box or a few scraps of wood. Take your time, have some fun, and see what you can come up with. It doesn't have to be perfect for you to enjoy the process. And when you're done, go ahead and try it again. Now that I'm done making all my little tiny luggage, let's pop in and see what's happening among the dolls. Now, in our last episode, everyone was getting acclimated to having the 2 new babies in the community. Violet and Albert were really happy about having their new son, and Albert was trying really hard to help Violet to care for the baby and allow her to rest and recover. But the majority of the time, she was being tended to by Big Ma and Marguerite because he had to help the men prepare the rooming house for the winter. Marguerite really enjoyed the times when it was just her, Violet, and the baby, because she really admired Violet and looked up to her a lot. And she really looked forward to those moments when Violet would allow her to hold the baby. Although Marguerite was the big sister and had helped her mother with Claude and Mabel when they were babies, it was something about this that was quite a bit different. Meanwhile, over at the original dollhouse, Aunt Charlotte was recovering nicely with the new baby, and Uncle Barley had taken off a few days to stay with her and the baby. And every day, Isabel and Aunt Vera were there to assist with food and cleaning. Over at the old dress shop, the men were working diligently trying to get things together for when Pop and Miss Betty get married. Now, if you remember in the last episode, there was a shift in power between little Tracy and Harley among the girls. But although there was a shift in power, when it came down to duties around the house, they were in the same boat. There was lots of food to be processed and to be prepared for the long winter, and both of them were assisting with various duties. And although this was definitely not their idea of assisting with the babies, Big Ma confirmed that it was. So Tracy's assignment was to sweep the pantry and then to help Harley sort through the fruits and vegetables and pick them to prepare them for processing and canning. By now, they couldn't believe what they had gotten themselves into. And they also couldn't believe how much work went into keeping the pantry stocked. Although Harper didn't care, Tracy was a little envious that Marguerite got to spend so much time with Violet and her new baby. Meanwhile, on the second floor, Miss Clara and Fiona went to go see the room that was deemed to be Miss Clara's new room for the duration of their stay. When the door opened, there was a lovely bed. Miss Fiona pointed out to Miss Clara how lovely the canopy was. But Miss Clara absolutely could not appreciate the lovely canopy because she felt like the room was too small and cramped. Miss Clara insisted with a big house like this, they must have other options. In the last episode, Miss Betty let Pop know that she didn't want a wedding. And although Pop and Miss Betty are full-grown adults, living in harmony with the rest of the dollhouse community is very important to them. So the next day, Pop had already arranged for the elders to meet him and Miss Betty in the parlor after breakfast. When Pop and Miss Betty entered the parlor, all the elders were present and they were seated, everyone except Big Daddy and Big Ma, and they stood at the head of the room, watching and listening. As Pop and Miss Betty explained that they wanted to have a ceremony without a big wedding, everyone began to question them as to why and when do they want to have this ceremony. Pop explained to the elders that Miss Betty wanted a simple ceremony and that they both just want to get married and move into their new home. Right at that point, Big Ma stepped forward and Minister Sherman stood up, questioning them further about their intent. No one had noticed, but Marguerite was listening at the door in the back hallway. As Big Ma and Miss Betty approached the door, Marguerite ran to the laundry room. And she stayed in the laundry room until Big Ma, Miss Betty, Miss Evelyn, and her grandmother, Miss Maisie, had entered the dining room. And she stayed in the laundry room as if she didn't have anything else to do when she had tons of chores to complete, but she wanted to know what was going on with Miss Betty and Pop. And after Big Ma and Betty talked for a while, Big Ma finally asked her, "What's the real reason?" And finally Miss Betty said, "I don't want a wedding." She said, "I had a wedding before, and my first husband fell. He was porcelain, and he broke, and they weren't able to repair him, and I ended up alone, and I don't want that to happen again, so I don't want a wedding." At this point, Big Ma realized that Miss Betty was a little superstitious, and that's why she didn't want to have a wedding. They talked a little while longer and came up with a compromise. And then she said, "Let's go talk to the men." And when they had returned to the parlor and had a brief conversation, Miss Betty and Pop talked for a short while, and it was finally decided that they would get married on Christmas Eve. So there would be no need for invitations, everyone would be present, Minister Sherman would be there to do their vows, and they could be off to their honeymoon by midnight. So it was all settled, they'd be getting married Christmas Eve. Meanwhile, the jars were cooling from all the cooking and canning, and the pantry shelves were starting to look full again. There would be a few more days of jarring and canning, but the girls had put in a good day's work to do their part to prepare the rooming house for the long winter ahead. Over at the new dress shop, Miss Marva and a couple of the other ladies were tending to the dress shop showroom to allow Aunt Bess and Aunt Janie to catch up on some much-needed rest after completing the inventory preparing for Christmas. After a quiet morning, there was a sudden knock at the door with a delivery. When the delivery was complete, the ladies had a floor full of beautiful hat boxes, and although the hat boxes were beautiful, the ladies were very concerned because Aunt Bess hadn't advised them about any deliveries today. And the other two ladies were even more concerned because Miss Marva signed for it.